Hello, and welcome to the New Mexico Bureau of Geology GIS informal lecture series. I am your host, Phil Miller, and today's topic will be ArcGIS for Adobe Creative Cloud. And this is one of those things that if you know you need it. And if you don't know you need it, you may be asking yourselves why you need it. So one of the benefits that we have found over the years, and this may be, okay, maybe I should start it off by saying this entire discussion is an opinion-based discussion. If you ask the people at Esri, their software is perfect for cartography. If you asked Adobe, their software is perfect for everything. So everything couched in this discussion is an opinion. There is no right or wrong way to do this. So we're really talking about opinions here. So I have a biased opinion in that I learned Photoshop and Illustrator long before I learned GIS software. And when I started working in GIS software, there were some things that I knew I could do faster in Illustrator. So what I'm going to say is if you're more familiar with Illustrator, there's probably lots of things that you would much rather do in Illustrator. And if you know you could do it better in Illustrator than you can do in ArcGIS, you're probably going to want to do it in Adobe Illustrator. So the why is a very, very subjective discussion point. Are you building WebGIS things? You probably are never going to use Adobe Illustrator. But if you're doing anything that is for a presentation, for a poster, for a report, something that isn't a WebGIS map or some functionality of needing it independent of the GIS so that your users can use it, most commonly what you're going to do in ArcGIS is export it to PDF. Everyone has that capability. That's all fine and good until you want to open that PDF and start working in it. When you open the PDF, you have a flat file. Everything is just thrown in there in total absolute chaos. One of the benefits, again, opinion, one of the opinions that I have of the benefits of using Illustrator in conjunction with your ArcGIS files is if I need to do some final fit and finish, and I export my Arc file from ArcGIS, all of my layer names and settings and configurations and organizations come into the AI file. If you just export it as a PDF, you basically get one layer group, you expand that layer group, and everything is in that one layer group. There's no organization to it whatsoever, and everything displays hierarchically. So that is one of the benefits that you get from just exporting as a PDF. The next benefit that you get from exporting it to AI as an AIX is that you can modify text boxes. Again, opinion, you can reflow text boxes faster in Illustrator than you can in Arc of any variety. Label placement, this is full opinion here. There's no factual statement here whatsoever. This is all absolute bias opinion. Is that label placement and the creation of leaders and the control of those leaders, control of those labels is easier in Illustrator, in my opinion. The other thing that you can do is there's times where in Arc Pro, you don't have the ability to stack layers in the same way to get a look that you want without duplicating the data. And in Illustrator, you can duplicate the data very easily and stack things in a way that makes it look the way you want it to look. So if you're working with, sorry, I skipped something when I was talking about the text boxes. If you're working on text on a line here, sometimes that text will come in where each individual character is its own individual feature instead of being text on a line. That's a little frustrating, but in Illustrator, it's super easy to get that on a line and manipulate that line and the way they flow across the figure or map that you're displaying is much more controllable, in my opinion. There are there is the ability to modify, in my personal opinion, some of the feature functionality and look much more rapidly in Illustrator than in Arc. So I'm going to give a quick example of that. And this is just one of many examples that I can give. And if I wanted to set this project up for all of the nuance that I wanted to show, this would probably be a 3-hour long session instead of probably a 45-minute, because there's a lot of differences in functionality. But I wanted to give one example of what it meant for setting up features in AI versus how you have to configure them in GIS. So I have this site buffer feature, and I've got a proposed site location. If I switch to the GIS, I exported it just like this because I knew that getting a look that would be more easy identifiable in the feature when everything is turned on and get my layers set up the way I wanted them to be set up and the visibility of those two features to be the way I wanted, I knew that I could come in and set up the symbology for these features here in ArcGIS, and I could play around with a couple things, and I could add a couple features and a couple layers, and I could see how things looked. In the time it takes this to render, I could have made like 10 different setting changes in Illustrator. That to me is a huge benefit when I'm trying to achieve a look, not capture the where of the information is. So now I have the ability to modify this setting. In Arc. Come on. In here, and I have to click menu inside of menu inside of menu, and it's all active in panes and stuff like that, which isn't much different than Illustrator. But in the time it takes me to modify these settings, like I said, I could have done 3, 4, 5 different iterations of that in Illustrator much quicker. And I can do it in a very systematic, kind of stylized way as well, that's controllable and reproducible in my appearance tab. So in this one, I've got stroke on stroke, and I can reorder these. I can modify the dash. I can switch the dash really quickly. I can modify the color really quickly. I can play with the opacity really quickly. I just showing all of those things right here, I can do all in this window right here versus trying to display all of that in Arc and modify those things. Okay, so here's the layer. I can add a layer in. I can go ahead and click that I want to change the color of this. So now I can click the color of that, and then I can pick the color. But if I want to pick a specific color, I have to click the color properties, make sure I'm in cyan, and now I can start tweaking that. Transparency. Oh, right. So now I got to go to the layer, and then I got to go to the feature layer, and then I can go to the blending mode, and then I can tweak. Whereas all of that was already up because of the way, okay, some of this is opinion again because of the way I have Illustrator configured, but nonetheless, it's a little bit more tangible. And then for these changes to take effect, it takes as long as it takes to render this every single time. ArcGIS is very slow at quick representation, whereas Adobe Illustrator is very quick at representation. It's because it doesn't have to pay attention to the spatial information. There's lots of load alleviated off of the software. So there's things that it can do quicker if you're looking for a look. Again, it's more specific for a look and function. Changing fonts happens a little bit quicker because I don't have to wait for it to render. If I select a font and I pick a different font from the list up here, I can change it more rapidly. So this is that content-aware, contextual information. I selected a feature and it comes up. So similar to what ArcGIS has adopted, this functionality has been available in AI for a while now. So those are the reasons. The why of why would you want to use Adobe Illustrator. The other factor that comes into play is I've got a lot of hill shades underneath here. So I've got two hillshades. That would be one, and that would be another. And currently I'm combining the two. And let's say I'm in ArcMap and I want to make the hillshade darker. You can do some things to do that, but you almost always have to recreate that hillshade at a different setting. You could go ahead and do what I'm going to do here in Arc that I'm going to do in Illustrator, and that's I could take a layer, select it, copy it, paste it in place, and now I've got a darker one. And you saw that happen real time. If I were to do that in Arc Pro, I would have to copy the layer, paste the layer, wait for it to draw, apply the blending mode, and all of those things just keep happening at a bit slower of a pace. So I can paste another one, another one, another one, another one, another one, another one. We can keep seeing this get darker and darker. I don't know how many paste and place I just did, easily 24 of them. And they all displayed effectively real time. That to me is way more beneficial in trying to go for a look than trying to get the data accurate. And again, it's because in ArcGIS, it has to display the data. Yes, if I really wanted it to be darker, I could go into ArcGIS and make the hillshade darker. I could tweak the settings. The other comment I'm going to make is we don't make our hillshades in ArcMap most of the time. We use a software called Global Mapper for our production level hillshades. And that's because we want a very specific look. We want that white flat area with shadows coming in. So there's a little bit of caveats to what I'm saying because it's more specific to our process as well. That's another factor that's a biased opinion in this presentation as a whole, is that these discussions are based off of our process. Okay, so that's kind of the why. Why would you want to do that? There are a lot more. But for the most part, those are the things that people want to know, especially when you're creating a figure. And if you were to, I'm going to use this example because this is the perfect example of what we're working through. Currently, if I were to have all of these features labeled, there would be a lot of labels on these features. I could go in and remove them from the AI manually. That would be tedious. But because I have the functionality of writing queries in GIS, I can actually make this happen a lot faster here in the GIS by writing those queries here because it directly is applicable. So I can limit things in the GIS using the database functions much easier. So if you're working with a database and you have database capabilities, you should probably use the database. Illustrator doesn't have the database functionality. I can't just easily query out features that I don't want. And that is where, the bias swings back to the ArcGIS. And within the team, one of the more common statements that I make is do in GIS what is easy and good to do in GIS. Do what is easy to do in Illustrator. But keeping in mind that you're trying to keep the look of the two the same. So there's lots of things that you can do in Arc that get you a better export from the beginning that you then don't have to do in the Illustrator files again. So do in GIS what GIS does well. Do in Illustrator what Illustrator does well. Okay, so that's the why. The next thing that I wanted to cover is the why nots. Why would you not want to export to AI? And this is a little bit more not about why you wouldn't, but it's more about so you want to, what are you going to have happen that's going to drive you nuts? The first comment that I can make right off of the bat, any patterns in ArcGIS are going to look horrible in Adobe Illustrator. So you wouldn't want to set up patterns in Arc and then export them to AI and then have to change them in AI, it's more work. So that would be a gotcha that would come up in that. So you'd want to be cognizant of your pattern's potential for causing you problems. And again, it's an opinion-based thing there because some of the patterns will look very good in Arc, and when you export them to AI, they will look okay. Some patterns won't look okay, and you'll want to be cognizant of that because that means changing the pattern in AI. And if you export it with a pattern and then have to change it in AI, it is a lot more work to change that pattern after the fact than just giving it a color, knowing that you're going to want to apply a pattern, and then apply that pattern in Adobe Illustrator. So that's kind of that discussion of do ArcGIS things in ArcGIS, do Illustrator things in Illustrator. One of the other things that is a problem that you will encounter, and we touched on this in the last session, and I thought it was a great segue into this week's session, is if I were to export this graphic right here, this map figure, sorry, not graphic, this map figure right now to AI, I would lose all of the functionality of being able to control a whole bunch of things because I have two things displayed simultaneously. I have rasters displayed and I have vectors displayed. So in this current format, I'm going to show this. I have rasters displayed. And I have vector data displayed. I should have done contacts and faults because that would have been easier. So I have a mix of vector and raster. I am not going to profess to be an expert on this functionality and what happens, but sometimes if you export mix of raster and vector, you mostly lose all of the functionality of your vector files because they get rasterized as well. So if I wanted to, let's say I wanted to change the colors of these in Illustrator because I wanted to highlight them, but I didn't want to change the data in GIS. If I export the rasters and the vectors together, I can no longer select the polygon and modify the polygon because I've made it a raster. So there are things that you lose the functionality of modifying when you export rasters and vectors together. So the big gotcha here is you have to export them as two separate files. So what I tend to do is I organize my data how I want it to display. And then I have to kind of make a mental list or a physical list of all of the things that I need turned on and off during the process of exporting. So in this case, I would want to turn off my hillshades because those are raster based, are raster data sets. And in this one, I believe that's the only one that I have that's a raster. Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, that's the only one I have a raster. So now I could go ahead and export this as a vector file by itself. And then I've got to kind of pay attention to what all is turned on and what I don't want and swap out what's turned on. So I've now, let's pretend, and I'm going to do the demonstration of exporting in just a second. But let's say that I've got my vector exported. You turn off everything that you don't need and everything that you don't need duplicates of, like all of your legend items, your scale bar, your scale text, everything that is a redundant data set, you might as well go ahead and turn off. So now I've turned off everything that's a vector, and now I can export my rasters. Okay, the cool part about this is when you export this, as stated previously, and I'll state it again because it's kind of important, ArcMap and Illustrator now have an agreement to retain transparency and blending modes. So the fact that I've got these two hillshades in this image, and I've got them both multiplying, that is honored in both of these. If I wanted to set one as being partially transparent, so let's do one 50% transparent and the other no transparency, it will honor that on export. So this is one of the things that I was talking about a little bit earlier, is you can make your ARC file match more closely what your AI file will look like, and then do the AI fit and finish at the end. So there's built-in functionality, and then you can go ahead and export this the way it is. So that's the biggest gotcha that I can warn everyone about: rasters and vectors being separate. That's kind of the biggest one overall. So let's go ahead and go through the process of exporting my vector file as an example. And I'm not going to do this in full actuality, but I'm going to show you the end results of what comes out. Right. And I'm going to turn off this. This is a process specific thing that I don't want to get the nuance of. So this is effectively what I need to export. Here is all of my vectors. What we want to do is go to the Share tab and export layout as AIX. And let's go through these settings now to export to an AIX. So you can retroactively switch between the different file types. If you were to click on Export AIX, and I don't know what these are. I don't remember seeing these previously. Interesting. I'm going to have to play with those. A PDF, for example. You will notice that I clicked on that. The PDF settings came in over here. If I switch back to AIX, I get my AIX settings back. And I probably just lost what I was going to name it. Yep. Oops. Oh well. Okay. So then we have our file type. AIX is an Adobe Illustrator Exchange format. It is not an Adobe Illustrator file. We'll get into that in just a moment. So then we can go ahead and give it a name. And I'm going to go ahead and name this very specifically for my function. Okay, so I've given it a name and a location where I want to export it to. Again, my name is specific because I don't want it. I'm actively working on this project. I don't want these files to be confused with the file that I need here in a little bit to actually export. Okay, so click Clip to Graphics Extent will crop the layout to areas within the layout element. My page is currently 8.5 by, what did I do? 5.5 inches. If that box is checked, it will exclude the white space outside of my graphics extent. I will get a file that is then 8 by 5. So clip to graphics extent. If I uncheck this, I get the full layout extent as the graphic. I'm doing this for very specific purposes. I build the page size a specific size because I want my bleed, or not my bleed, I want my margins, but I do only want the graphic itself because this is a figure, not a map layout. This is a personal preference thing for specifically the task I'm doing. That's why I have this check. Most of you will probably want that unchecked. Keep layout background. In this case, I've got a white page. This will retain that white page. Full disclosure, this drives me nuts. I never have this checked. I never want a white background to my Adobe Illustrator file because then I've got this white polygon underneath everything that I always have to deal with. And I just don't see the benefit of that, personal opinion here. Okay, and then we come to compression. I don't have any images in here. So this is kind of a moot point for this part. But let's say I am exporting the image. I tend to do LZW, which is a lossless compression format for rasters, and I almost always export it at a highest quality. There are many others that you can choose from, including no compression. This is a personal preference thing, or depending upon what your end product is going to, that would be a consideration for that. But for the most part, I tend to use LZW. That is a personal preference. That's a personal bias. It's what I learned when I first started doing this, and I've continued doing it without any ill effects. So I tend to do the LZW. This applies to if I've got the combo raster and vector together. This will turn the vector resolution to a 300 dot per inch image. So that's what that is referring to. When you export your rasters, here you'll see the raster resample. You can do this at 300 or whatever the case may be, which is appropriate for the resolution of your final product. Again, if this is a web map or a web PDF or something like that, you may want it to be 92 DPI if it's going to a PowerPoint or something like that. But then you'll want to make sure that your size is the best it is. Generally speaking, export the best quality you can. Fonts. This is a big one. I strongly recommend you embed all of your fonts so that when you go to AI, they all come in the document. If you're working with the FGDC GeoAge, the FGDC GeoSymbol fonts, these break 100% of the time. So I'm sorry about that. But this will embed the font into the document so that it is part of the document. The user, technically speaking, if you're exporting to a PDF, technically doesn't have to own the font in order for the font to display. It embeds it into the document for use. With the AI file, I don't know that it necessarily really does embed it into the document because you can change it, so it's not like it's saved within. And it's very different with how it's saved within the file versus coming over to AI with the file information. Okay, this one is kind of an interesting discussion point, and I'm going to belabor this just a little bit. Convert character marker symbols to polygons. So if you've got a font symbol that is a character, like the spring symbol is, that little circle with the squiggle down showing the spring outflow direction, that is a font character. When you export to AI, you can either have it retain that font character, or you can have it convert it to a polygon. This checkbox says convert markers based on fonts into polygons instead of using their symbol from the font itself. I tend to like using the fonts because it's lighter in the software than the polygons. The more vectors you have, the slower AI Illustrator comes to respond to things. And you're going to say, well, Phil, then why do you have this checked? Because there's currently a problem in Arc Pro that when you export some font character marker symbols as the font, this is unchecked. When this is unchecked, it actually doesn't display the font in the layout for computer science reasons, for lack of a better word. The area of the box that is allowed to display that font character is not large enough to display that font. So you actually have to make the thing larger so that it can display it, but it also makes your font larger. So then you have to shrink your font back down to size. I know that probably makes no sense unless you've encountered it or experienced it. So what I'm going to say for right now, check this checkbox so that those fonts are converted to polygons and you have the information you need displayed on your legend on your A, or not on your legend, on your map, figure, graphic, whatever it is, displays without other intervention on your part. In the future, this may change. So be mindful of the fact that I'm making a belabored comment on this because of the belabored nature of the functionality and what I think is a bug currently. And I've talked to other geologic surveys who have had the same problem. And this is the solution we presented to them, is to go ahead and check this checkbox and export it to AI. And that is the solution currently. So that's why that is. And then color management, if you care about your colors, embed your color profile. This assigns it that ICC profile, whether it's RGB or CMYK. I could get into an entire informal lecture series discussion on RGB and CMYK, so I'm going to skip that for this one because that's my pedestal, my soapbox that I stand on. And then you can go ahead and click export. This will then export it to that AIX, the Adobe Illustrator Exchange format. And what you will end up seeing is something like this. So a file name that you named it, .aix. This is not an Adobe Illustrator file. This has to be opened using the extension ArcGIS Maps for Adobe Creative Cloud. That's why this informal lecture series topic is titled ArcGIS Maps for Adobe Creative Cloud, is because that is the extension that is needed in order to take this AIX and convert it to an AI file so that you can then continue the functionality that you want. When you open an Adobe Illustrator Exchange format file, there is the extension in the middle of those two softwares that you need to have installed. So I want to show what happens so that everyone's aware of what happens, and then we'll talk about installing the extension and all of that stuff. Okay, so there is my test example, and I'm going to go ahead and open it in Adobe Illustrator now. So it does open in Adobe Illustrator, but it is not an Adobe Illustrator file. It's an Exchange file. So when I double click on this and open it, you will see a dialog box that says what color profile. No, that's right. This is specific to me. This is me. You may or may not see this based off of what I'm working on. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And now that I've got it clicked OK, now we see the ArcGIS Maps for Adobe Creative Cloud extension splash screen turn on. You then see a couple of splash screens for the ArcGIS Maps compilation. And then once that's done, I can click close. And now I have my vector file ready to do whatever I need to do with it. Again, next you would want to export your raster file and then combine the two together using that paste in place functionality. So with that, one of the things to pay attention to is I was already signed into the extension. If I wasn't signed into the extension, all those splash screens would have popped up, but it would have then finished with a warning that said you are not signed into Adobe ArcGIS Maps for Adobe Creative Cloud. If we come to Window, Extensions, we can now see my ArcGIS Maps for Adobe Creative Cloud extension. That's interesting. I prepped this different from an expectation. Because I have the ArcGIS Maps for Adobe Creative Cloud already installed and I'm already signed in actively using it, you don't see the splash screen. But that is the caveat. A splash screen will show up, and that splash screen wants you to sign in to the extension. If you don't have the AIX extension, you will not be able to sign in. Nothing happens. So what we need to do then is we need to download the ArcGIS maps for Adobe Creative Clouds. For Adobe Creative Cloud. I have to download that extension. So you can see here that there's pricing associated with that. There's some information of the overview of what it is. So I went in over my personal discussion points of this. The overview, if you search for ArcGIS maps for Adobe Creative Cloud and click on overview, it'll give you an overview of what the software is and does. The big caveat for this software is you must have an ArcGIS Online maintenance contract, and you must be a named user in order to export to the Adobe Creative Cloud. So that's one of the big gotchas with this is you have to be a named user in order to sign in to the ArcGIS Maps for Adobe Creative Cloud extension. So that is the big caveat. If you work at the New Mexico Bureau of Geology and you have a need for the ArcGIS Maps for Adobe Creative Cloud extension, please let me know and we can go ahead and install that software on your computer, that extension on your computer for you. And then I will have to go ahead and give you a named user account for ArcGIS Online in order to do that. So that is one of the big comments that needed to be made there, is that you need to have the extension. Okay, so then the next thing that follows with this is Phil, but I've got a raster file and now I've got this vector file. How do I get these two together? Well, you would go to your raster file, you would select all of the features and you would copy it, and then you can paste in place, and then you've got the two files combined. And if you have your if you have your Adobe Illustrator set up so that paste remembers layers, those layers that you just pasted in will go to the natural place that they were in your ArcGIS file. So that is one of the things to pay attention to, is where these things are and where you, when you paste them in place, where they end up. Now, you can see that it did end up in the geology layer, but I had it further down in the list. So now I would have to go ahead and minimize some features to drag it to the location where I want it to be to match my GIS file, if you want it to match your GIS file exactly. So that is the gist of working with the Adobe Creative Cloud. Most of this discussion was all about the personal preferences of using the extension, more so than the extension's functionality and capability in that of itself. It's the whys you want to use it and the how to use it. There isn't much more to it than that. And that's the reason why we talked about all those discussion points at the beginning, is what is it, why would we want it, and what would we do with it? So if you know you can do it in Illustrator better or faster or with more control, or you're more familiar with it, or whatever those opinion-based discussions are, know that you can export it to AI and then go ahead and modify it for the cartographic purposes of your purpose in the Adobe Illustrator environment. And again, I'll say it again, there are a few things that I find much easier to do in Adobe Illustrator than I do in ArcGIS. And one of the key things is modifying and manipulating labels and configuring things that way. Again, personal opinion there on that. Okay, so I want to open up the AIX again, because one of the other things that I noticed This is awesome. This is literally the thing I was going to do, was to sign into the AI, the ArcGIS Maps for Adobe Creative Cloud extension, literally because I saw the little count button in the upper right-hand corner, and I was like, oh, there it is. That's how you sign in and sign out. Okay, so this is what happens when you don't have an an ArcGIS online account. This is what you will see, is that you're not signed. Well, technically speaking, this is what you see when you're not signed in. But this also could mean that you don't have an ArcGIS online account. When you click OK, it pulls up the dialog box that allows you to sign in to your ArcGIS online account. And this is the important thing. We are not set up to do it in an enterprise environment. You want to sign into your ArcGIS online account. So when I click on that, I can type in my, whoops, whoops. Even though you click keep me signed in, it doesn't. And then you click sign in, and then it will go ahead and sign you in to the ArcGIS, oh, I said it right, dang it. ArcGIS Maps for Adobe Creative Cloud extension. We can then go ahead and close all the things, and the file will open back up. Okay, there's one other thing that I just thought of that is beneficial to discuss in this. If you end up opening an AIX and everything is blank, save it as an Adobe Illustrator file, close Adobe Illustrator, open Adobe Illustrator, open the AI file, all of your data will show back up again. One of the other things that I have noticed that occurs in these files, which has been true since we have been working on Adobe Illustrator files that were exported from ArcMap, is that you end up with a lot of clipping masks and a lot of clipping groups. Sometimes they are useful and beneficial, sometimes they are not. So that is kind of a personal preference thing for how things function. But one of the warnings, again, if you've got patterns in your ArcGIS files and you release clipping masks, you release all of those clipping masks for the patterns as a whole. And that is problematic. So if I do that on this, we'll see if I have any in here that are going to be problematic. I am saving this, and I will close it out because sometimes some of those don't show up until you open the file back up again. Interesting. I was expecting this pattern to end up being a square box all over the place. Interesting. I'm not going to say they fixed it because I'm almost certain I was working on a different graphic the other day and the patterns absolutely were released in a way that like there would be a pattern for this entire minimum bounding box here. So releasing your clipping paths is kind of a preference-based thing, but the clipping paths, clipping masks, the clipping masks will prevent you from selecting specific features and being able to drive down into your files quickly and easily. So I kind of have a process by which I release all of those clipping masks, but that's also a byproduct of the fact that I don't do patterns. I don't export patterns from Arc. I tend to build a layout configuration of my map frame in a specific way that prevents me from having patterns, so that when I come into AI, if I need to add patterns back, I can add them back in. That is a 30-minute discussion in and of itself, how I do that. So just know that the clipping masks are a problem and can prevent you from getting to the data easy. It's not prevent you from getting to the data. It's usually have to click into the clipping mask in order to edit the data inside that clipping mask. And if you've ever worked with clipping masks in Adobe Illustrator, you know what I'm talking about. If you don't, you'll experience it soon enough.
Did you want to talk about how Adobe updates Illustrator faster than Esri updates the extension?
Do you want to go into that?
I can. It's just when Adobe does a major release of their software, sometimes it breaks things because Esri has not updated their extension yet, and you either have to roll back a version of Illustrator to get it to work or wait for Esri. Usually they get it done within a couple days. This also works with Photoshop too. So Photoshop has its own versions, and it will break if they update Photoshop before they update the extension.
And that was one of the statements that I was going to make only, was that it seems like it's a couple of days. It's never like a full release of ArcGIS that you have to wait for that to happen. It's not like that. It's just a couple of days.
So I have my updates for Illustrator automatic updates turned off, so that doesn't happen without me knowing about it. But sometimes it still does because I go to update Illustrator and then realize that I broke it and I got to go back to the version.
And I've been lucky and never had to do that. And that's the reason why I'm not as familiar with it, is I'm lucky that way. Awesome. I would like to thank you all for participating in this informal lecture series. And I am a little uncertain as to what the next topic will be for next week's lecture, but we will decide that, and we'll see you in the next session. Thank you all for participating. As always, thank you for the GIS team for helping me put these together and function through these, and Mike Timmons for letting me do this. I hope everyone has a great weekend, and we'll see you in the next session.